Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Richard Ryan, and I am Senior Washington Correspondent for the Detroit News and President of the National Press Club. I'd like to welcome club members and their guests in the audience today, and those of you who are watching on C-SPAN or listening to this program on National Public Radio. The video archive of today's luncheon is provided by Connect Live and is available through the National Press Club website at press.org. National Press Club luncheons are also carried live by many sites on the World Wide Web. Press Club members may also access transcripts of our luncheons at our website. Non-members may purchase transcripts, audio, and videotapes by calling 1-888-343-1940. Before introducing our head table, I would like to remind our members of some future speakers. On Tuesday, June 5th, Ralph Nader, consumer advocate and third-party presidential candidate, will discuss consent and conceit, the two-party duopoly. On Friday, June 8th, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, Archbishop of Washington, will talk about international human rights. And on Monday, June 18th, Terrence Jones, President and CEO of the Wolf Trap Foundation for the Performing Arts, will be our guest. If you have any questions for our speaker, and I trust that you will, please write them on the cards that are provided at your table and send them up to me. But remember to write legibly, because if I can't read it, I can't ask it. And I will ask as many as the time permits. And I'd now like to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. But please hold your applause until all head table guests are introduced. From your right, Carl Lubsdorf, Bureau Chief, Dallas Morning News. Marianne Means, Washington columnist, Hearst Newspapers. Robert Mary, President and Publisher, Congressional Quarterly. Vera Glasser, freelance. Llewellyn King, King Publishing Group. John Harris, of the Washington Post and winner of the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize for reporting on the presidency. Dana Priest, Washington Post, and winner of the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize for reporting on national defense issues. David Hess, Vice Chair of the NPC Speakers Committee and a former President of the National Press Club and a reporter for the National Journal News Service. Skipping over our speaker for a moment, Ken Dalecki, Deputy Managing Editor, the Kiplinger Washington Editors, and the Press Club member who organized today's luncheon. Thank you, Ken. Marty Allen, Chairman of the Gerald R. Ford Foundation of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Helen Thomas, Hearst Newspapers columnist. Eleanor Clift, Newsweek. Donna Leinwand of USA Today. Austin Kiplinger, Chairman of the Board, the Kiplinger Washington Editors. And Ken Eske, retired Scripps Howard editorial writer and a former chair of the NPC Speakers Committee. We are honored once again to have with us the 38th President of the United States, Gerald R. Ford. Welcome back, Mr. President. President Ford long has been a friend to the National Press Club, to the press in general, and I might add, to me personally. When I came to Washington in 1969 as a rookie political reporter for the Detroit News, President Ford, then a Republican congressman from Grand Rapids, was the House Minority Leader. Even as busy as he always was accessible and would take the time to patiently tell me what was going on. I particularly remember the night of October 13th, 1973, when President Nixon announced his selection of Mr. Ford to succeed Spiro Agnew as Vice President. I drove out to Mr. Ford's house in Alexandria, and even though it was after midnight, he invited me in. We talked of many things that night, his hopes and goals as Vice President and his political future. We also talked of the recent death of his dog, Sugar, and his intention to attend Red Flannel Day, the following day in Cedar Springs, Michigan, as he had so many years as a congressman. Red Flannel Day celebrated the fact that Cedar Springs had an underwear factory and billed itself as the red flannel capital of the world. I might have gotten a raise out of that interview, or at least I should have. This is the 15th time President Ford has spoken at the National Press Club. He spoke once as president and today marks his 14th appearance to present the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prizes for distinguished reporting on the presidency and on national defense. Mr. President, you have many friends and admirers in the room today. First among them in our audience is, of course, your wife, Betty. President and Mrs. Ford will celebrate their 53rd wedding anniversary in October. And the President will observe his 88th birthday on July 14th. Also with us today are three of the Ford's four children, Susan, Jack, and Mike, his brother Dick Ford, and two grandchildren. Last year, during the Republican National Convention in Philadelphia, President Ford gave the country a brief scare when he was taken to a hospital emergency room. He had suffered 2 minor strokes and was treated for a tongue abscess. In reality, President Ford was again showing his friendship toward the press. His hospitalization was the only real news to come out of that convention. The rest of it was a carefully scripted coronation of George W. Bush and Richard Cheney. Returning to Washington today, Mr. President, must be like old home week for you. Dick Cheney, your chief of staff, is now vice president. Donald Rumsfeld, your defense secretary, is back at his old post. Paul O'Neill, your deputy budget director, is now treasury secretary. I wonder, sir, if you might be stalking the administration in hopes of staging a comeback in 2004. Just 2 weeks ago, President Ford was awarded a profile in courage by the John F. Kennedy Library for his brave but politically costly step of pardoning former President Richard Nixon almost 27 years ago. The passage of time often brings with it a reassessment of a presidency, a rewriting of the journalist's first draft of history. This certainly has been true of President Ford. Writing recently in the New York Times, journalist and former aide to presidents David Gergen wrote, "After all the scandals, shenanigans, and excessive spin of intervening years, Mr. Ford shines through as a man of honor, decency, and plain talk, qualities that look good in the rearview mirror of history." Please join me in welcoming former President Gerald R. Ford to the National Press Club.
Thank you, Dick. I'm very grateful. Much too kind, but I appreciate it.
Mean every word of it.
Okay, thank you.
Every word. Thank you.
Thank you. Please sit down. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much, Dick. You're much too kind and far too generous, but I thank you from the bottom of my heart for our long and very, very good friendship. It's especially true coming from a Michigan newspaper man. I'm delighted to return to the Press Club, as Dick said, for many, many years. According to my statistics, it's my 14th time to be here. For Betty and me, it's one of the highlights of the year, not least of all because of the chance that it affords us to see so many old and very dear friends. So I thank all of you for coming on this occasion. We also look forward to this opportunity to recognize some of America's very finest journalism. Back in 1987, the Gerald R. Ford Foundation established two $5,000 prizes to be awarded annually for distinguished reporting on the presidency on the one hand and national defense on the other. Over the years, we've had some superb guest great winners. Today, we have two more outstanding young journalists. Before making the presentations, I'd like to acknowledge the scholars, the journalists, and the others who made up the two panels that were entrusted with reviewing the numerous submissions for the two prizes. The names of these 10 highly accomplished men and women are listed in the press releases at your individual tables. They take their work seriously, and let me say, I am deeply grateful for the superb job that they have done over the years. Thank you very, very much. I think we ought to give them And now it's my distinct pleasure to present the 2000 Gerald R. Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting on the Presidency by John Harris of the Washington Post. In awarding John the prize, the judges concluded, and I quote, by the resourcefulness in reporting and clarity in writing, Harris detailed President Clinton's masterful use of modern polling techniques and analysis to advance his objectives, document his proven skills in campaign tactics and strategy, reveal the brilliant facets and sometimes inexplicable flaws of personality and intellect that made the last president of the 20th century one of the most admired and at the same time one of the most controversial in recent history, end quote. If journalists write the first draft of history, and often they do, if any can compare with John Harris. John, I am pleased to present to you this award for this fine work that you've done. Marty?
President Ford, thank you very much. To cover the White House, as many people in this room know, is almost by definition to have a strong sense of your own inadequacy as a reporter. You're covering the politician from a great distance. It was a full year that I'd covered President Clinton at the Washington Post before I had any kind of extensive conversation with him. You're trying to find out what happens at meetings where a very small number of people are in attendance from sources who, to put it mildly, aren't always as candid as they might be. And my own sense of inadequacy was probably greater than that of the typical reporter, because my partner when I first came to the White House beat in 1995 was Ann Devroy, who was one of the most formidable journalists of her era, who many people in this room know, and who died, unfortunately, in 1997. And all through those first couple of years, I was motivated primarily in my work by the hope or the fear that it not be too obvious to colleagues and to readers that I simply wasn't in Ann's league as a reporter. Over time, Ann's example became less intimidating to me, and it started becoming empowering. That's because Ann had a sense, her real strength as a journalist was that she understood the power of journalism and understood the power specifically of the Washington Post, and realized that the other guys don't necessarily have all the cards. We've got some, and Ann knew how to play them really better than anybody. And the advice we give even now to the new team that's covering President Bush on how to cover a new administration is go back to 1993 and read Ann's clips. I mention Ann because she was a winner of the Ford Award in 1993, and also because she was a mentor of mine, and we miss her very much. Fortunately, most of my mentors in journalism are still alive, and several of them are here today, including Bill McAllister, who is the bureau chief for the Denver Post, and who hired a whole generation of reporters at the Washington Post, and I'm very proud to say that I'm one of them. Don Baker, who is the Richmond bureau chief, was for many years the Richmond bureau chief of the Washington Post, and taught me a great deal about covering politics. Marilee Schwartz is the political editor of the Washington Post, who cares not just about cares not just about our copy, but cares very much about the people who write it, and that's why she is a beloved figure for all of us who cover politics at the Post. Liz Spade is the national editor at the Washington Post and is also here. along with our managing editor, Steve Kolish. He's part of a generation of editors who is updating and reinvigorating the tradition of high-impact journalism at the Post, and I thank her very much. My mother, Nancy Hamlin, who gave me my love of language, is here, and also my wife, Ann O'Hanlon, also of the Washington Post, who suffered with me through 6 years of covering the White House beat of too many nights when I came home late or not at all. So thank all of you very, very much. And above all, thank you to the Ford Foundation and to President Ford. In addition to Ann Devroy, previous winners at the Post of this award were Lou Cannon and David Hoffman. And to be included in a list like that is about the best compliment I've had in quite a long time. So thank you very much.
Now it's my distinct pleasure and privilege to present the 2000 Prize for Distinguished Reporting on National Defense to Dana Priest, also of the Washington Post. Dana's winning series, quote, "The Proconsuls," end quote, took us behind the scenes of the 4-year regional commanders-in-chief to reveal their evolution, their internal function, and their political influence. In showing how our military have assumed new responsibility in some of the world's most remote areas, the series also raised questions about a profound yet largely unexplored shift in the making of U.S. foreign policy. As a result, Dana didn't just report the news. She made some news on her own. The judges were particularly impressed with her resourcefulness in gaining access to the commanders, as well as the literary gifts which she brought to bear in describing the projections of America's strength overseas. Dana, it's a high honor and a rare privilege to present to you this prize for your distinguished reporting in 2000. Congratulations, and also to the Post.
Well, I'm honored to be here. I remember the impression it made on me 8 years ago when my colleagues Ann Devroy and Bart Gellman, who also won the Defense Reporting Award for the Washington Post, were here. I just stood in awe of Bart, thinking, how did he get those military stiffs to open up and talk to him? And how did he escape all the public affairs officers at the Pentagon with their suitcase-sized tape recorders? They followed him and later me around everywhere, but they didn't get on board the Sinks planes that I was flying on. And the few of them actually who did fell asleep or stopped paying attention on hour 3 or 5 or 9 of the marathon talks the Sinks and I had when we flew around the world twice. I'm deeply grateful to the Washington Post for letting me pursue this growing sense that I had that the Pentagon's influence on foreign policy had broadened significantly after the Cold War ended. Known among reporters for its frugality, my Post editors, and maybe I shouldn't say this, never once protested the expense of traveling around the world with 4 stars. And when the military bureaucracy seemed to be getting the worst of me, they urged me to press on. Steve Call, Jeff Lean, and especially Marilyn Thompson were great advocates, and they are wonderful editors. Karen DeYoung, a mentor who kept at me with the most basic question, what does this mean? I would like to thank her too. As for the military, I have to say I feel very privileged to have had the chance to get to know their world and to understand the challenges and the obstacles that they confront when civilian leaders put them on the front lines of non-war missions, be it peacekeeping in Kosovo or diplomacy in Uzbekistan or Indonesia. I know I have a number of secret advocates who helped make this project possible, and I should probably just thank them privately. Finally, one of the most memorable moments during this project came when I returned to Hawaii after a week in Indonesia and East Timor with Admiral Dennis Blair, who's the SINC at Pacific Command. Not 5 minutes after I closed my hotel door and turned my cell phone on, it rang. It was my 9-year-old son, Nick. "Hi, Mom, do you know where my soccer shoes are?" He and his 5-year-old sister learned to weather my absences. It was not always easy, and I'm sure that they succeeded so well because of my husband, Bill Goodfellow. So I thank him and all of them as well. Again, thank you to the judges and to President Ford, and thanks for this honor.
Congratulations. Great job. Well, thank you very much, both of the winners, and you have our heartiest congratulations. Returning to the National Press Club has become a ritual of spring as far as I'm concerned. Sort of like the swallows coming back to Capistrano or the cherry blossoms blooming on the tidal basin. For Betty and me, it has the feel of a truly genuine homecoming. Among other things, it gives us a chance to renew some wonderful acquaintances with the Fourth Estate. In this spirit, I'll be delighted to answer your questions when I conclude with my initial remarks. Several weeks ago, a friend alluding to the evenly divided United States Senate wondered out loud whether the balance of power might be upset by a Republican changing parties. Forget it, I told him. That'll happen the day that I receive the Profile in Courage Award from the Kennedy Library. Therefore, I'm a little reluctant to make any forecasts about the future. In truth, this is a time of surprises in the nation's capital, none greater than the contrast between what we were led to expect in the wake of last November disputed elections and what the first months of the Bush presidency have actually delivered. Think back to that seemingly interminable 36 days during which the airways and the op-ed pieces were filled with historic punditry. For millions of Americans, it was their introduction to Rutherford B. Hayes. While scholars debated Hayes's effectiveness as a minority president, other learned discussions sprang up about the Adams family dynasty and the odds of history repeating itself in the 21st century. If there was a theme running through the erudite debate, it boiled down to a single word: legitimacy. Would the new president, taking office amidst inflamed emotions and heightened partisanship, be able to claim anything more than the keys to the White House? Would he be able to lead a thoroughly divided nation, or would he become and reduced to a ceremonial caretaker? This is a subject of more than passing interest to me. In August of 1974, I took the presidential oath amid a still greater controversy. Unlike George W. Bush, I hadn't received a majority in the Electoral College. I hadn't won my party's nomination, not earned any primaries, nor contested any election beyond Michigan's 5th congressional district. What I did carry into the White House was the goodwill of the American people, their prayers, and the mutual trust of my congressional colleagues on both sides of the aisle. This wasn't sufficient to spare me a satirical jab or two. But take it from me, Mr. President, there are worse fates than being the target of Saturday Night Live. All this came back to me during the long weeks of hanging chads, dealing, and national uncertainty. In the aftermath of the Supreme Court's final decision, we were treated to plenty of learned hand-wringing over the new president's fate. But I have known the American people too well for too long to entertain doubts about their reverence to the Constitution or their acceptance of a constitutionally sanctioned election. In the months since, my faith has since been vindicated. No doubt, some partisans will continue to refight last elections until the next election. Some historians will fight it a long time after that. But the overwhelming majority, including most who supported the Gore-Lieberman ticket, have agreed that America has one president and the office that he holds, like the democracy he personifies, remains strong and resilient. His ideas are being debated, but not his legitimacy. The best evidence of this is the unhesitating way in which President Bush has moved to put his stamp on economic and foreign policy. Few Washington handicappers last fall would have given favorable odds on a substantial across-the-board tax cut by Memorial Day. President Bush took office with an unmistakable set of priorities and a shrewd game plan for their enactment. When it comes to economics, he understands that something that has guided many in this town. The 1990s saw the rise of an entrepreneurial culture in which countless Americans became investors for the very first time. In the process, many came to feel each April 15th as if they were being punished for their prosperity, as two-wage earner families were catapulted into higher tax brackets and millions of people found themselves hit with capital gain taxes that were used to be the sole province of the rich throughout our country. The secret of democratic capitalism is that it spreads the riches around, which is exactly what has happened to a great many mobile income, middle average American households. Traditionally, opponents of tax reduction had relied on the well-woven argument of fairness, as if it is fair to tax people twice in our society or to penalize married couples for raising the strong families we all claim to value. Perhaps the biggest change revealed by the new administration is the definition of fairness as a part of the democratization of wealth. As more and more middle-income families join in the benefits of democratic capitalism, the divisive rhetoric of us versus them has lost much of its appeal. Increasingly, it is us, is them. By eliminating the marriage penalty, strengthening the child credit, and greatly reducing and perhaps eliminating the estate tax, the Bush tax cuts promise to return both dollars and decisions to grassroots America. This is a potentially historic realignment, hardly the cautious or the timid agenda envisioned by many of the pundits last fall. Moreover, the president is doing exactly what he promised he would do, working with moderates in both parties to fashion a tax passage that commands broad support. Hardly less significant is the education package now working its way through the Congress, House, and Senate. To be sure, there are some in my own party who feel that the Bush bill has become, in effect, a Bush-Kennedy bill. Yet for most Americans, and for just about all American parents with school-aged children, the most ambitious education reform in a generation deserves high grades for its constructive bipartisanship. When all is said and done, the president will get the national testing standards that he has made the centerpiece of his education program. Democrats will get even more money on top of the significant spending increases already called for by the White House. Is it a perfect bill? Of course not. Perfect bills from my 25.5 years in Congress seldom pass, if only because there are no people on Capitol Hill who can define perfection in legislative processes or results. But it is a significant step forward. It reiterates our commitment to the American classroom and to classroom instructors. Teachers are a national treasure. They deserve our gratitude and more. Again, who would have predicted last fall that a new administration with razor-thin majorities on Capitol Hill would even tackle, much less achieve, sweeping reform? So much for questions about legitimacy and competence. Indeed, the hallmark of this young administration has been its willingness to think boldly and not shy away from politically difficult issues. With tax cuts in the education bill, President Bush is not only making good on his promise to change the tone in Washington, but he has changed the substance of public policy in ways that will stand him in good stead when he tackles even thornier, more difficult issues such as Social Security and Medicare reform. No less important is the unmistakable ability of the President himself, most recently displayed on his trip to California last week. As an adopted resident of the Golden State, Betty and myself, we can tell you there is plenty of blame to go around in the current energy crisis. In fact, there appears to be more blame than megawatts. In the speech of, or in the search, I should say, for scapegoats, there is a tendency to seek out obvious villains, to assign black hats and white hats with all the sophistication of a late-night Western. Here again, the administration deserves praise for its willingness to tackle serious problems in a serious way, to resist the temptation to point fingers or mislead people at a time when the credibility of government is on the line. Short-term solutions, so-called, may get us through the next election, but they will hardly address the fundamental issues of adequacy, reliable energy supplies for a nation whose appetite, to be blunt, have outstripped our available resources. When it comes to foreign policy, the President's measured response to China, I think, was a 10-stroke. And I think he provided a good answer and a good solution. Colin Powell has the makings of a first-class Secretary of State. And as one who worked closely with Henry Kissinger in bringing about majority rule in Black Africa, I can take heart from the Secretary's recent trip to that continent and his outspoken commitment to fighting AIDS in Africa. The top-to-bottom review of Pentagon policy ordered by my old friend Don Rumsfeld is, I believe, the necessary prelude to a similarly examination of reform of the nation's military. Come to think of it, you gotta have, or you gotta like, I should honestly say, a White House with Cheney, Greenspan, O'Neill, and Rumsfeld. They were a great part of my team, and I'm very, very proud of them, and I think they'll do a superb job in the White House in the future. Now let me conclude by saying I'm delighted to answer any of the questions from any of you in the audience. Thank you.
Well, Mr. President, this should come as no surprise to you, but our first question comes today from Helen Thomas. And Helen, Helen asks,
What are her credentials in the press?
I think she's established her credentials over a sufficient period of time that she can ask the question. The question, sir, is there any room anymore for moderates in the Republican Party? And if so, how are you going to win them back?
Well, Helen and I firmly believe that there is an opportunity to move the Republican Party to the center. We should have learned that you can't win a presidential election just relying on the hardcore right wing of the party. The Democrats illustrated very well that they couldn't win the presidency with just the hardcore left wing, with Dukakis, Mondale, and the others. And Bill Clinton came along and talked a good game about a middle-of-the-road Democratic Party, and he won the election. The Republicans have to not only believe in the umbrella concept where all elements, all people that fundamentally believe in the Republican Party can be a part of it. And I am convinced that we'll learn from past mistakes, and I see evidence across the country as I travel where the party is broadening its base, and if it wants to win, it has to.
I should have mentioned earlier that besides half a century distinguished journalism on the part of Helen Thomas, she's also qualified because she, like me, is from Detroit. A number of questioners have asked, of course, about Senator Jeffords' switch and that he went over to become an independent, but in fact gave the Democrats control of the Senate. And some people want to know, do you anticipate that there may be some other moves among other Republicans to do the same thing, perhaps including Senator McCain?
Dick, I have no inside information on that problem. I don't know Senator Jeffords, so I can't comment. I was disappointed. I would have preferred that he stay in the Republican Party. I would have preferred that the leaders in the Republican Party, in the White House and the Congress had made maybe a bigger effort to keep him as a member of the party. Substantively, when the Senate was 50-50, the White House was going to have difficulty getting results unless they were willing to compromise. And they did on the tax bill, they did or will on the education bill. On the other hand, with the switch where the Democrats, starting next week, will control the Senate, it'll be more important for the White House to offer, to compromise, to find a workable solution on the legislation. And it's my hope, and I happen to believe, that the White House has learned that if they want their program through, whether it's with a Republican control or Democratic control, they have to be willing to sit down and negotiate and come up with final answers that are bipartisan.
Returning again to Senator McCain, do you think that he might switch, or I know you say you didn't know, but what do you consider him to be an asset or a liability at this point when he's sort of wavering between what he's going to do?
Well, I think Senator McCain did what he honestly believed was right to campaign for the presidency back a year ago. I never condemned him for it. I think competition in the political arena is healthy. And I happen to believe that McCain's success earlier in the primaries was beneficial to the Bush team. It made them a better team to take on Al Gore and Lieberman. So I personally don't think Senator McCain is going to switch. I hope he doesn't. And I believe the competition within the party, as he demonstrated a year ago and as he's doing on some issues now, I think it's healthy. What's wrong with a little competition? I don't believe in a rubber stamp organization in politics, and the Jefford case and the McCain potential, I think, is wholesome in the political arena. I should not object to that, because I challenged, when I first ran for Congress, I challenged an incumbent of 10 years in the Republican primary. I thought that was good for the party, good for the country, and certainly good for me.
You mentioned how President Bush should reach out to the Senate and to the House to help pass his policies. This question wants to know if you think that House Republicans are right in trying to run the House solely through the Republican Party, or do you think that Speaker Hastert should work more with Dick Gephardt?
Well, the margin in the House, as I recall, is about 10 or 11 votes, and that's not much of a margin out of 435. We don't know what redistricting will do come the next election. In California, the Democrats will pick up a couple of seats, but in other states, we will do better where we control the governor and the state legislature. So I think the Speaker and his associates on the Republican side in the House ought to try to work with the Democrats on the major legislative proposals that are coming down the road from the White House. You can't ignore the opposition when you have only a 10 or 11 vote margin. You've got to get some help, because there will always, on any piece of legislation, be a defection on your side. So if I were the Speaker, I would be very kind and gentle and hopefully get cooperation from the other side of the aisle.
As president, would it have been easier for you to work with a Congress that is as closely divided as this one, both in the Senate and the House?
Well, Dick, let's go back and review the kind of Congresses that I dealt with. After the '74 elections, the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate by better than 2-1. Now, those are pretty formidable odds, and I must express my gratitude for Carl Albert and John McCormick and some of the other, Tip O'Neill particularly. We worked together, and I was benefited by a good personal relationship with John McCormick and Carl and Tip. And the net result is we did get some things done, even though we were outnumbered 2-1. The current leadership in the House ought to look back and say how lucky they are, because for 40 years the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives.
So I take it you would say that the Republican Party has become too rigid and intolerant of dissension from within its ranks?
Dick, I don't think the party overall has created the image of intolerance. The Jeffords dispute was well illuminated, and I won't challenge the decision of Senator Jeffords. I wish he'd stayed and been a part of the team, but I don't think that the leadership on our side has been too rigid. They might have done things better or differently, but that's a tough thing to try and keep your own team on your side and not capitulate to the demands of one member out of 50. You've got to play the game using some good judgment and balance.
There are a number of questioners here who talk about the tax cut that's Bush proposed and has been passed by the Congress. You talked about it a little bit, but are you worried at all that it might bring back the deficits and wipe out the surpluses that we now seem to be enjoying?
I trust that the action of the $1.3 trillion tax bill will not bring about a resumption of deficit financing. I think from the projections that I have seen, unless they go wild in adding things over and above the contemplated budget, I think they can stay within and still have a balanced budget in the next 5 or 6 years. They've got some tough issues to take into consideration. The demands for more money for the military, and I think that's justified. The demands for more money for education, I think, is justified. So we can't add a lot of these extras that are just perks for a particular congressman or a particular senator. If they stick to the overall budget structure, I think they can continue to have a balanced budget, including the tax cut that's just been enacted.
If the tax cut in a few years does result in deficits, do you think it should be immediately repealed?
Well, they certainly ought to reassess what the circumstances are, and if they find that they've made a mistake, they ought to correct it. Sooner the better.
On a more personal note, what exactly do you plan to do with your tax rebate check you're going to get?
Well, I'm not going to hold my breath. But I know Paul O'Neill, and he publicly said the checks would be in the mail sometime in July. Of course, we've all heard that old story, the check's in the mail. I hope the Post Office Department can deliver promptly and effectively.
And you'll be waiting by the mailbox to receive it, I trust. Do you think that President Bush should start immediately, along with the Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, to beef up the military, or wait a little bit longer?
I have consistently, for the last few years, said that the Defense Department was not given adequate funds for their various basic programs. We need more money for research and development for new weapons. We need more money for operations and maintenance so that the troops will have the necessary military hardware for their assignments. We need a better pay structure for military so that young people, after they've been in the military for, say, 4 years, will re-enlist. Compensation is a necessary ingredient in keeping our military forces available. We've been losing too many good young people, male and female, who after a first term decide to leave the military. We ought to have incentives to keep them in the service. And I understand from the recent legislation submitted by the White House, that's one of their major points that they're making. But overall, you've got to increase the military budget from the current figure that was left by Clinton of about $400 billion a year to, you'll have to add anywhere from 25 to 50 billion to make sure that these necessary requirements are met.
Do you think, sir, that the Bush administration is wrong in its plan to scrap the ABM treaty that we now have with the Russians in order to go forward with building an anti-missile defense system?
I believe that we should proceed with the necessary research and development in the anti-missile program. I know that Russia and some of our European allies are opposed to that because they feel that it will require that the ABM treaty either be modified or dumped. From my reading of the ABM treaty, which was approved, 20 years ago, it may be outdated. And I don't think an outdated treaty involving our national security should jeopardize our national defense. So I think we should proceed responsibly in necessary research and development, and within a year or two we ought to be able to know whether the missile defense systems will be adequate, because although Russia may not be a threat, these rogue nations have the potential of a missile attack, and we ought to have at least a program being developed to meet that challenge.
A couple of related questions. This one asks, as a former president, could you comment on President Bush's dealing with China? And this question notes that during your administration, the Maiguas incident was a crisis that you handled in a very quick and decisive manner. And would you like to comment on the handling of the spy plane being forced down in China during the Bush administration?
I thought the White House under President Bush handled the Chinese spy plane incident firmly but with patience, and we got good results. I firmly believe we should proceed in our relationship with China on the basis that they are a friend, not an adversary, and that any differences we may have on human rights, military programs, or anything else, we should work with them in trying to resolve the issues. Not to treat them as an enemy, that would be counterproductive. I firmly believe that the White House can and must work in conjunction with the current leadership in China in a constructive way, not in an adversarial way.
This again is another sort of a two-part question, and it's based upon the recent incidents in Texas involving the Bush daughters. This one asks, did your children, and 3 of them are here at the moment, give you any legal troubles while you were in the White House? And then if you would go further beyond that and talk a little bit about whether or not you think the press may have overdone it a little bit in reporting the drinking incident with the Bush daughters.
I think the press was too vigorous in some instances in dealing with White House families. As far as I know, our children had no incidents that required any monitoring or otherwise. I think the children in the White House have to understand that they're in a glass cage, and that whatever they do is oftentimes exaggerated, expanded beyond fairness. So White House children just have to be more cautious, more careful, and if they do, the press will treat them that way. And in the meantime, the press, I hope, will be less aggressive and will respect, to the extent possible, the privacy of children of the White House.
I take it then you don't think that was a fair story for the newspapers to report?
I think they had to report whatever the facts were, but I think some of the interpretation, Dick, is what I objected to.
President Bush, as you have mentioned, has called upon many of your administration and cabinet officials to come back to Washington to be of service here. Has he called upon you in any way for advice or perhaps a job?
Well, he's got a lot of good younger people that are doing a better job than an old has-been would do. I have talked to him before he took office about certain problems and programs. He's been a little preoccupied, and I have not bothered him directly, although both Betty and I have on several occasions since Bush and Cheney took over to go to Vice President Cheney directly. We felt that was probably a better way to express our views on one or more issues.
Along with employment in Washington, this question wants to know what you think of a lifetime appointment for the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. In this case, obviously, Mr. Greenspan.
Well, Dick, I'm a firm believer. I think that Alan Greenspan, over a period of about 10 or 12 years, has done a superb job. He was my chairman of the Presidential Committee on the Economy. He did a superb job as working for me. I think under very tough circumstances, Alan Greenspan has followed a very narrow path, controlling the cost of money and the availability of money. If they're too generous with money throughout the United States, they stimulate inflation, and that would be a catastrophic result. If they're too tight, they could be so careful with the availability of money, they could also bring about a recession. So for the last few years, the Fed under Alan Greenspan has controlled the cost of money and the availability of money very skillfully. Now, they were generous when they reduced rates. They have been, on occasion, tightened it when they tried to control it, keep it under control. And the net result is, I think, we are going to escape a recession after 10 years of a very, very prosperous economy in the United States. So I applaud Alan. I congratulate him.
Very good, sir. Before we wind up here with the last question, I would like to do a little bit of business. Number one is to once again present you with a certificate of appreciation for your 14th appearance here at the National Press Club. And of course, one more mug to add to your collection. You can have a very large dinner party now with these mugs, I suspect.
Well, Dick, I save every one of them. Come by and I'll prove it to you.
Well, I'll do that.
I thank you, and I thank the Press Club for inviting me.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask one last question before you go, and just briefly. A great deal is made of a president's legacy, as what he has accomplished. And it's rare that the legacy of a First Lady is discussed. So what do you think that your wife's, Mrs. Ford's, legacy as First Lady should be?
I firmly believe that Betty's legacy will be one of frankness, high moral principles, a dedication to performing her responsibilities in the White House at a very, very high level. I think she was first class in every way, and she made up for a lot of my deficiencies and difficulties, and for that I thank her. And you know, Dick, after 53 years, you don't, or at least you shouldn't, change partners, and we have
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, and we will look forward again to seeing you the first week in June of next year. I'd also like to thank National Press Club staff members Melinda Cook, Pat Nelson, Joanne Booz, Melanie Abdel-Dermond, and Howard Rothman for organizing today's luncheon. Also, thanks to the NPC Library for the research, and thank you all for coming, and have a good evening. Good afternoon. We're adjourned. An excessive spin of intervening years, Mr. Ford shines through as a man of honor, decency, and plain talk, qualities that look good in the rearview mirror of history. Please join me in welcoming former President Gerald R. Ford to the National Press Club.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very grateful. Much too kind, but I appreciate it.
Mean every word of it.
Okay, thank you.
Every word. Thank you.
Thank you. Please sit down. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much, Dick. You're much too kind and far too generous, but I thank you from the bottom of my heart for our long and very, very good friendship. It's especially true coming from a Michigan newspaper man. I'm delighted to return to the press club, as Dick said, for many, many years. According to my statistics, it's my 14th time to be here. For Betty and me, it's one of the highlights of the year, not least of all because of the chance that it affords us to see so many old and very dear friends. So I thank all of you for coming on this occasion. We also look forward to this opportunity to recognize some of America's very finest journalism. Back in 1987, the Gerald R. Ford Foundation established two $5,000 prizes to be awarded annually for distinguished reporting on the presidency on the one hand.
National Press Club, to the press in general, and I might add to me personally. When I came to Washington in 1969 as a rookie political reporter for the Detroit News, President Ford, then a Republican congressman from Grand Rapids, was the House Minority Leader. Even as busy as he always was accessible and would take the time to patiently tell me what was going on. I particularly remember the night of October 13th, 1973, when President Nixon announced his selection of Mr. Ford to succeed Spiro Agnew as Vice President. I drove out to Mr. Ford's house in Alexandria, and even though it was after midnight, he invited me in. We talked of many things that night, his hopes and goals as Vice President and his political future. We also talked of the recent death of his dog, Sugar, and his intention to attend Red Flannel Day, the following day in Cedar Springs, Michigan, as he had so many years as a congressman. Red Flannel Day celebrated the fact that Cedar Springs had an underwear factory and billed itself as the red flannel capital of the world. I might have gotten a raise out of that interview, or at least I should have. This is the 15th time President Ford has spoken at the National Press Club. He spoke once as president, and today marks his 14th appearance to present the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prizes for distinguished reporting on the presidency and on national defense. Mr. President, you have many friends and admirers in the room today. First among them in our audience is, of course, your wife, Betty. President and Mrs. Ford will celebrate their 53rd wedding anniversary in October. And Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Richard Ryan, and I am Senior Washington Correspondent for the Detroit News and President of the National Press Club. I'd like to welcome club members and their guests in the audience today, and those of you who are watching on C-SPAN or listening to this program on National Public Radio. The video archive of today's luncheon is provided by Connect Live and is available through the National Press Club website at press.org. National Press Club luncheons are also carried live by many sites on the World Wide Web. Press Club members may also access transcripts of our luncheons at our website. Non-members may purchase transcripts, audio and videotapes by calling 1-888-343-1940. Before introducing our head table, I would like to remind our members of some future speakers. On Tuesday, June 5th, Ralph Nader, consumer advocate and third-party presidential candidate, will discuss consent and conceit, the two-party duopoly. On Friday, June 8th, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, Archbishop of Washington, will talk about international human rights. And on Monday, June 18th, Terrence Jones, President and CEO of the Wolf Trap Foundation for the Performing Arts, will be our guest. If you have any questions for our speaker, and I trust that you will, please write them on the cards that are provided at your table and send them up to me. But remember to write legibly, because if I can't read it, I can't ask it. And I will ask as many as the time permits. And I'd now like to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. But please hold your applause until all head... And the President will observe his 88th birthday on July 14th. Also with us today are three of the Ford's four children, Susan, Jack, and Mike, his brother Dick Ford, and two grandchildren. Last year, during the Republican National Convention in Philadelphia, President Ford gave the country a brief scare when he was taken to a hospital emergency room. He had suffered 2 minor strokes and was treated for a tongue abscess. In reality, President Ford was again showing his friendship toward the press. His hospitalization was the only real news to come out of that convention. The rest of it was a carefully scripted coronation of George W. Bush and Richard Cheney. Returning to Washington today, Mr. President, must be like old home week for you. Dick Cheney, your chief of staff, is now vice president. Donald Rumsfeld, your defense secretary, is back at his old post. Paul O'Neill, your deputy budget director, is now treasury secretary. I wonder, sir, if you might be stocking the administration in hopes of staging a comeback in 2004. Just 2 weeks ago, President Ford was awarded a profile in courage by the John F. Kennedy Library for his brave but politically costly step of pardoning former President Richard Nixon almost 27 years ago. The passage of time often brings with it a reassessment of a presidency, a rewriting of the journalist's first draft of history. This certainly has been true of President Ford. Writing recently in the New York Times, journalist and former aide to presidents David Gergen wrote, "After all the scandals, shenanigans, table guests are introduced. From your right, Carl Lubsdorff, Bureau Chief, Dallas Morning News. Marianne Means, Washington columnist, Hearst Newspapers. Robert Mary, President and Publisher, Congressional Quarterly. Vera Glasser, freelance. Llewellyn King, King Publishing Group. John Harris, of the Washington Post, and winner of the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize for reporting on the presidency. Dana Priest, Washington Post, and winner of the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize for reporting on national defense issues. David Hess, Vice Chair of the NPC Speakers Committee and a former president of the National Press Club and a reporter for the National Journal News Service. Skipping over our speaker for a moment, Ken Dalecki, Deputy Managing Editor, the Kiplinger Washington Editors, and the Press Club member who organized today's luncheon. Thank you, Ken. Marty Allen, Chairman of the Gerald R. Ford Foundation of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Helen Thomas, Hearst Newspapers columnist. Eleanor Clift, Newsweek. Dinah Linewand of USA Today. Austin Kiplinger, Chairman of the Board, the Kiplinger Washington Editors. And Ken Esky, retired Scripps Howard editorial writer and a former chair of the NPC Speakers Committee. We are honored once again to have with us the 38th President of the United States, Gerald R. Ford. Welcome back, Mr. President. President Ford long has been a friend to the